So the old coalitions that we had built today are not no longer relevant given the circumstances that we find ourselves in. Just because, for example, on climate change, there is no way you can produce a solution without working with the United States. I mean, you can do the G77, talk about, defying the world, but in the end, solutions have to be found.
So in this week's column, you've looked at sort of the convergences. Jaishankar is in, the foreign minister as Jaishankar is in New York and Washington. He's going to be in America. We've used that as a peg to talk about how the Biden moment is such. The Biden in the US, the way he's taking Washington's foreign policy, has room for India to grow that relationship. Now you've talked in terms of the bilateral relationship. Now we've seen for some years, actually, no matter what administration is there in either country, it has been on a growth trajectory. Regionally, because of China and the Indo-Pacific as well, you see there is a sort of, at least for the medium term, if not the long term, we have a certain convergence of interest with the US. The third tier in this that you bring in is the multilateral institutions, in which that is one of those places in which Delhi has a sort of, you can call it a hangover, you can call it a tradition of a certain kind of positioning vis-a-vis the first world and America in particular. We've always been more, say, with China, if not with China, but with Russia post the Cold War. How do you, if you could elaborate on that a little bit, how in terms of our role in multilateral institutions can we work more with the US and that traditional sort of opposition, why this is the time to overcome?
Yeah, I think for a long time, Delhi has treated multilateral diplomacy as some kind of a virtuous politic of signaling virtue, of standing with the good and fighting the evil type of framework. But there were some good things that India took up on apartheid and racial discrimination, those kind of issues. But as the world moved on, I think it's been a challenge, certainly after the Cold War, where our bilateral relationship with the US kept advancing, but our multilateral positions remained somewhat stuck in the old groove. Because, for example, after 90, we believed that, look, we can work with China to create a multipolar world. But China shook us awake by saying that, look, they're not going to let you into the nuclear club. They were not going to support you for the permanent seat in the UN Security Council. And they were taking up territorial issues because our grouse, ideological grouse with the West, really US and Britain was, they took Kashmir to the UN. They were the ones who were trying to take away India's territory. But today it's Pakistan, it's China that is doing it at the behest of Pakistan. So the old coalitions that we had built today are not no longer relevant given the circumstances that we find ourselves in. Just because, for example, on climate change, there is no way you can produce a solution without working with the United States. You can do the G77, talk about defying the world, but in the end, solutions have to be found. We found last time in the earlier meetings before the Paris Agreement that China was cutting deals separately with the US. You're supporting China, and China was doing a bilateral deal with the US. So I think we have to navigate somewhere in between. It's not that we switch from one camp to another camp. We have our equities in the developing world. We must continue to engage the non-aligned movement, the G77, and the developing world or the global South. But at the same time, as a large economy, as the third largest economy, as one of the major actors in the international system, we must also work with the other powers. So this is a new moment where we recalibrate our global policies. One, to suit our interests, as well as taking up issues which are right, which are morally needed. So it is that new balance. I think we have a chance now to construct that. Partly because of the pandemic, that the US collaboration with us in vaccine production has become critical both for our national interest, our regional strategy, as well as for the global efforts to fight the pandemic. So there is a new convergence here. In the past, we said, look, what India did in New York had nothing to do with what India did in Washington. But today, I think the important thing is to bring the two into some kind of a sync.
So in the piece, by the way, everyone should check it out. It's on the indianexpress.com. It's in print, of course, if you have the paper, and the link should be wherever you're seeing this video in the description as well. So one of the things that you don't mention, the last time the foreign minister there is a strategic, economic, and now with the pandemic, there are other areas of convergence, even necessity, one can argue, for both countries to work together as we go forward. But in terms of just the sort of, how do I put this, the niceties of diplomacy, the last time Mr. Jaishankar was in the US, as well as more recently, we found that India has been a bit prickly, almost like you said, almost Global Times-esque. You know, saying that US legislators can't bring up certain topics about India, talking about big countries, you know, media will talk, some legislators will talk. Now they've also shown an increasing sort of, the government domestically is showing a sensitivity towards reporting about the current crisis. Do you think it's incumbent on the foreign minister this time to at least not behave the way he did last time, in some senses, to not show that kind of hypersensitivity? Because that is something that the memory of which is still fresh, because it wasn't that long ago, you know, just before COVID last time.
I think the conditions are very, very different. I mean, I would say this time there are not going to be too many public meetings, or we are still in the pandemic mode. And I think the focus is quite clear. And I think to get the range of issues in relation to pandemic moving. And we've seen many of the critics of India, including Pramila Jayapal or Ro Khanna, the legislators, Democratic Party, Progressive Wing. They're all fully supporting, the COVID relief. So there is a genuine bipartisan consensus to support India at this difficult moment. Look, I think it is the domestic issues. How do you relate, when external criticism? And I think it's always been a problem, but my sense is that it is a large democracy like India. I think it must focus on its own reform. I think you can't beat this back, because in the end, as a democracy, we owe it to ourselves. And so therefore, the battle is within. It's not that the Americans are going to fix India's problems. That you can't have, if they could, Pakistan would be a democracy, China would be a democracy. So I think democracy is not a foreigner's gift. It is something we have to do. But in terms of how we engage with the world on these issues, I think it needs to be one where we listen, and the real struggle is to reform within, rather than, because there will be criticism. I mean, I think there's no escaping that.
So the final question, which is it might be repetitive for people who are reading the column, but I'll still ask it for a clarification. There's an interesting piece towards the end of your article, the column this time. You talk about how both in Biden's America and now India, in terms of our industrial policy, we're shifting back. I mean, that the sort of neoliberal consensus, or the that was there in America, there's moving back towards a kind of welfare state as well as manufacturing. And India is doing a similar thing. Earlier it was Make in India, but that those traditional industries, that kind of industrialization is still important. Both countries are realizing. You can't just let that go. How do you see that playing out in terms of bilateral relations, and how can New Delhi benefit from this shift in Washington?
I think at this point, I think it's important to talk to the United States. I mean, because they're in the middle of a big debate. I mean, I think the Reagan-Thatcher consensus, or the so-called neoliberal consensus that emerged in the late 70s, in the 80s, it became the dominant philosophy in the US. And the Democrats, who were otherwise critical of it under Reagan, adopted it. So then we had for 4 decades, US that focused on globalization, believed that, benefits will trickle down to the workers, that it didn't really matter if manufacturing jobs went to China or Mexico. So that line of argument is beginning to unravel. Trump partly attacked the policy by saying, trade is bad. And now Biden is talking about a foreign policy for the middle class. And the emphasis that, you need to restore domestic manufacturing. In fact, Biden, whose own parents are Irish, also basically a strong empathy for working class. I mean, that he brings today. And I think he sees one of the reasons Trump won the 2016 elections was because large number of the working class voters deserted the Democratic Party. So today Biden wants to bring them back into the Democratic fold. And he's willing to confront the big companies, the big tech. He's saying, they should pay more taxes. He said, he's not going to sign new trade agreements till workers' interests are protected. So this is a new line.
Yeah.
Of course, there is also pushback. The great Amazon, Google are pushing back. They don't want to pay taxes in the US. You have Wall Street Journal all saying, Biden is spending too much money on welfare. This is going to create inflation. So that battle has begun within. So it's a different moment. So in the past, both of us were saying, look, we are for globalization, we want trade, but then we couldn't come to an accommodation. But today their line is changing. And for us both, and for good or bad, it was China that has driven this change in both Washington and Delhi. It is the China trade argument that has compelled Biden to say, look, they need to manufacture, they need to invest in science and technology, they need to invest in AI. In India, we're saying, look, China is taking us to the cleaners, we need to manufacture. Now, within that framework, is there a room to take a fresh look at the trade issues? Because under Trump, I mean, there was a lot of pressure, but we couldn't finish the deal. And the latest US trade report in the last few days still talk the old language. Look, India is trying to, make in India, but that's exactly what Biden is trying to do as well. So I think this is not the trade bureaucracy won't be able to do it for us. We need a strategic political conversation. Look, there is a new moment. What is the way we can work with each other? Can we do this resilient supply chains where trusted supply chains become important for the US? The US is not going to be able to produce everything there. Now can we? So is there a new way in which we can work together to be able to produce a new understanding on trade and commerce? And with that, also to reform the World Trade Organization, which is under great stress. So the old orthodoxy is under stress, and the new framework is not yet there. So this is a good moment to talk politically and with the top layer of the Biden administration.
Great, sir. Thanks a lot. We should do. Everyone, check out the piece. It is on the indianexpress.com. It will be on the homepage as well as the opinion section. Thank you so much, sir. We will see you next week.